Okay, so welcome everybody to our Global Accessibility Awareness Day Lunch and Learn session, jointly hosted by Sight and Sound Technology and our friends and colleagues at the British Assistive Technology Association, more commonly known as BATA. My name is Stuart Lawler. I'm Head of Digital Content here at Sight and Sound Technology. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to what has become for us a yearly session now. We're always doing something on Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which falls on the third Thursday in May each year. And it's a day that has been created to get everyone talking, thinking, and learning about digital access and inclusion, and the more than 1 billion people with disabilities the world over who are impacted to some degree. With me today from Sight and Sound are my colleagues Sharon Lyons and Fanula Murphy, who will be helping to moderate and look after chat and raised hands, etc. And speaking of that, if you'd like to get in touch with us during the session today, and we'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts on a really big issue that we're going to spend the next 45 or 50 minutes talking about, then we'd love to hear from you. You can do so on Zoom by raising your hand. You can press Alt and Y if you're using a PC, or you can use, if you're on one of the mobile apps, you can activate the raise hand button. Similarly, as Sharon just said a moment ago, you can use chat. Alt and H is the option for chat, or you can activate the chat button if you're on a mobile app. And we will make sure to leave plenty of time for your questions. Now, we're absolutely delighted today to have two distinguished panelists, and I want to thank them sincerely for giving their time. Really interesting views, I think, from both our panelists, which you'll hear in just a moment, but let me introduce them to you. Richard Holmes is Stakeholder Engagement Manager with RNIB. He's also the chair of the VI Special Interest Group with BATA, the British Assistive Technology Association. Richard has 25 years experience working in the charity sector, where he has held a variety of policy, campaigns, and public affairs roles. Josh O'Connor is Director of Interaccess, who are a leading Irish accessibility consultancy. Josh is ex-chair of the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group at the W3C, and he's the ex-editor of the WCAG 2.1 Accessibility Standards. And he's an all-round good guy as well. Josh and I have known each other for a long time. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us here. It's great to have you both. We have a lot to talk about in a relatively short time. Richard, as I was thinking about the session yesterday, I was thinking about the last time I was in a bank, which was about a year and a half ago, because I had to bring one of those obscure things called a check in to put it into my account. And when I went into my local branch, there was two things I noticed. First of all, it was very hard to find somebody who could help me, but I did find someone. But the role of that person seemed to be to help people to use these automated machines that were used to lodge checks. And the whole thing seemed to be very automated, and these guys were just walking around to help people out. Is that kind of what's happening in the banking system, in the high street banks, maybe?
Good afternoon, Stuart. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for getting right into the core of these issues. Well, firstly, I think you're probably quite fortunate to have a branch that you could go to with the considerable pace of closures. And I think what you've touched upon is a really key point about what is being put in place to mitigate the closures of branches and therefore the inability of everyone, but obviously principally people of sightless that we're looking at today, to be able to conduct face-to-face banking. So I think the drive is very much towards using machines that are in branches, but if that isn't an option, then obviously we're driven much more to online and to app solutions where it is theoretically possible to pay in a check via an app. I've not, as a person with sight loss myself, I've not braved doing that. I prefer to go into a branch to do that. But I think that the trend is very much towards driving traffic to the web and to web solutions and to apps. And I think it's just probably just as a general point, it's always good to think about how impactful and how beneficial technology and advanced technology have been for us as visually impaired people over the last sort of 20, 25, 30 years. But I don't think we can always assume and believe that progress isn't always going to be linear. I don't think there's, sadly, there are plenty of examples where that is shown not to be the case. So, yeah, the short answer to your point that yes, the drive is much more towards using automated machines where they're available in a bank, and much more towards using online banking and apps where that's more appropriate. But I suppose the access issues are very similar in both instances, aren't they?
Okay, you've kind of nicely segued there to the online banking and apps piece. I think because Josh, you're doing this stuff every day. This is your bread and butter: auditing apps, auditing websites, looking at making sure, I suppose, that people aren't left out. And
right.
I know we're speaking very generally, I suppose, but what's the state of online banking from where you're sitting, kind of watching this stuff?
Thanks, Stuart. Great question. And thanks for the introduction as well. People would pay good money for that kind of thing. I'll tell you, first of all, before we even go into that, I think this touches a broader societal issue, really. The lack of actual, physical access to services, or even to people, never mind the service. That's a broader social thing as well, which impacts people with disabilities, older people, all of us who need the touch points with humanity, and to some degree that you may not be getting in your day-to-day, so to speak. And I think it's a really important thing, because it's societally, it's something that's almost like a death by 1,000 cuts in a way. Now, because we do have technological solutions which are great, but when everything is mediated through a technological solution, it removes the human and the humane aspect of things, and our society becomes much more mechanistic and much more impersonal. So those are things that I also worry about as well. But I guess that wasn't really the question, Stuart. The question was what's happening in terms of the state of the art. Well, I think there's more awareness around accessibility for sure, and then combined with the very legislative, the various rather legislative and policy type requirements around accessibility. There's certainly much more discourse around it, which is great, and people are looking to conform to standards, to be more accessible, because essentially there is a stick there. From a banking perspective, that I think, and not just explicitly from a banking perspective, but there is a commercial imperative also to have, effective, well-designed systems that can solve the needs of users. But I think many of the challenges faced by the sector haven't really changed, and there's just potentially more awareness around the need. And we have the European Accessibility Act coming on stream, which is going to cover banking and related services, as well as broader services too. So there's certainly much more awareness. But where that actually leads and how successful that is, we don't really know at this point, Yeah.
I'm really glad you've mentioned the European Accessibility Directive, because I didn't know that it was going to cover banking. So that's really good to hear.
Yeah, the Act covers banking. It covers a broad range of services beyond, websites, smartphones, e-books, operating systems, ATMs, ticketing systems, like banking services, services relating to travel. It's really, really broad.
Okay. Richard, what are well, I suppose obviously there are the obvious maybe implications when people get left behind, but maybe with your BATA hat on or your RNIB hat, I'm not sure which one you want to wear. They both work. I think they both work well together anyway. But when people get left behind, and I suppose you're working in that policy area, campaigning, what are you seeing from maybe the people that you're talking to, or who are contacting you, whether it's through RNIB or through BATA?
That's a really, really good question, actually. If you think of the demographic of visually impaired people being mostly older, then you can start to think about some of the implications from the move from traditional face-to-face banking towards online banking, with the high levels of digital exclusion faced by vision impaired people, twice as likely to be digitally excluded than the public as a whole. So that's a significant issue in itself. But then, how do we deal with that as individuals? Well, we find there's always workarounds, always find workarounds. So that might be transferring banking responsibility either on a consistent basis, or perhaps more alarming on an ad hoc basis, to perhaps a friend, a neighbour, a carer, and handing it basically, therefore handing out your personal banking details and all the potential implications that can lead from that. So there's that danger. I think what we're hearing is, I suppose, if you think about the narrative of being able to access cash simply as a simple action of going to an ATM and to access cash, that's one issue. It's become increasingly difficult. But then at the other end, the payment process is becoming increasingly difficult as well, with the increasing rollout of touchscreen payment systems. So I suppose we're hearing problems at both ends of the process, and they're sort of intrinsically linked in the sense that people might want to have access to ready cash to mitigate the risk or the potential risk of coming up against a touchscreen payment system during their during their day of shopping, right, whatever there might be. So it's kind of a vicious circle. If it's more difficult to access cash because there are fewer ATMs and the ATMs don't have an audio output, then you're more reliant on a payment system. But if the payment system isn't accessible as well, then you come back to will the accessibility access be available? Will the shop know it's available? And if not, then again, it comes back to the initial point I made about diminished financial independence and control over one's finances, which is a fairly basic thing that most people take for granted, right?
Yeah, and we were talking off air just before this session started, weren't we, about these chip and pin terminals, which I think have become really prominent recently. And I've had at least 6 experiences. I had one very recently where I was out to lunch with someone I didn't really know well at all, and I went to pay and ended up giving the pin to the person behind the desk, behind the till, because I just thought it was the quickest way to do it, and it was a very public place. And you do feel very disempowered, don't you?
So disempowered is precisely the right words, Stuart, exactly the word. It's just disempowering. It's obviously a security issue. And again, it comes back to, it's one of those things, isn't it? Things are connected because they're connected in our lives, aren't they? So if you're having a good day, it's probably all right. You can kind of go with it. It's okay. But if you've had a day where you've tried to walk along your own street and there's bikes and there's wheelie bins and there's other obstacles, and you fall over those, and it's raining and you get a face full of wet hedge, and it's having a bad day, it's going to be something that these things are all incremental, aren't they? They're all linked up. So yeah, it's frustrating, but if it's anything you've come up against, it's probably kind of doable. But the point is, I suppose, that everyone else would, I suppose, in a similar way to getting any other information, health information or information about your taxes or whatever, everyone else, our sighted peers would quite rightly expect that they would receive that and see that first, whereas banking information could become increasingly like health information, something that it's private, only between your carer, your neighbour, and yourself. So whichever way it shapes up, potentially don't get that information firsthand, and then you're sharing it, and there's all sorts of alarming potential from sharing financial information with anybody. But the exploitation issues are alarming, aren't they?
And I suppose we're all a little more aware now of, these spoofing calls people get, somebody pretending to be your bank, and they're very real. So there's that as well to consider. Josh, I do want to talk about, because we got an interesting email in just before this session, which kind of was quite positive, saying that some things are working really well. And one of the things we wanted to talk about is things that do work well, because clearly some things are. I hadn't used Revolut until about a year ago, and some people said, why aren't you using Revolut? I didn't think I needed it. And now I'm wondering how I managed without it. And these kind of, what we would, for maybe want of a better word, non-traditional banks who've set up with these apps. Do you think they're maybe a little more willing to do it right, or have you seen anything there?
I haven't really, Stuart, because I haven't really been looking at that sector in the context of the work that Interaccess does in auditing and testing, not particularly in that kind of mobile space. I suppose, what would you call it? Like the traditional, they're not like traditional banks. What would be interesting though would be to look at that to see what the difference is in terms of their general accessibility and usability. I would think, I mean, I don't really know Revolut, but for example, I know N26, they're a German-based bank, and they've got like really well designed app and like that, which I think you can tell that there's a demonstrable effort to make the online experience as good as possible. Now, I can't really speak to its accessibility, but for its general usability, it's actually really good. Simple little things that are generally giveaways that people have really thought about that and about usability and the human factors aspect of things. I think traditional banks are maybe have been a little lazy in the sector as well, and have a lot of legacy systems that they don't necessarily want to change. Some have been more proactive than others in the space, but I do think there's a commercial imperative basically, and these new players in the space will realize that if they can design and make these systems as you know, as usable and as accessible as they can, well, then there is a commercial win there. Like there are 80 million people with disabilities in the EU.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So if you have an audience who can't go to traditional banks, for example, because their services are terrible or because they're, you know, whatever it is, they're going to go look for alternatives, right? So that's a substantial market right there, you know.
Absolutely. Josh, I just want to bring you, it is a more general question, but it does have relevance. And I think, and you made mention earlier to usability and maybe accessibility. And there is obviously a link in general. If something is usable by the majority, is there a better chance it's going to be accessible?
You could say that there's been more attention paid to positive user experience, right? I mean, in a general sense, yeah. But you see, it's like if you say something is inaccessible, I mean, my first question then is inaccessible to whom?
To whom? Yeah.
Right, because otherwise accessibility is such a broad church, so to speak. It's such a broad definition. It covers many cohorts and tranches of users with different needs and sometimes competing needs. And in fact, that's something that people don't understand when they come to accessibility first. They think it's this kind of one umbrella that they can put everybody under and it's going to work. But actually, you may have, you know, needs for one group that are actually antithetical to another, and they're direct opposition to the needs of another, this kind of thing. So, you know, but it's generally a good rule of thumb if something is quite usable. Even, I mean, I'm sighted, and if something is generally quite usable, that there's a culture within an organization which pays attention to user needs. Because if you do that, then it means that you can build requirements that will support those needs. If you don't understand the user need you're trying to meet, and you're just trying to conform to some standard, you're potentially in trouble because you can end up being going down a wrong road, which looks like a right road, but is really only a token, or you end up with token accessibility, such as, you know, Braille on the wall of a museum for an art for something which you'd have to crawl over the exhibit to actually use it. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Or Braille on the drive-by ATM, wasn't that always the? I don't know if it's a joke, or somebody said it is in the States. There is Braille on the drive-by ATMs.
Yeah,
So
a classic one I've seen, Sue. Sorry, Richard, just to give you a laugh. There's one I've seen which is vending machines with Braille behind the glass, which is just brilliant.
Okay.
Oh, that's absolutely genius. What I think is really important and links all those things together that Josh makes those excellent series of points is that the umbrella issue is classic designing things about consultation with visually impaired people, right? Because none of those things would happen if we were involved from the commencement of a process, but we get involved partway through a process, or worst of all, at the end of a process, and then things get retrofitted, and then again, depending on how you feel on a particular day, they're either less unusable or they're slightly more usable, depending on your mindset. But crucially, they're not fully usable, and that's the key point. So the point about being fully involved during the process is absolutely key to exactly reduce and remove some of those anomalies that have been mentioned. And I think the previous point is a really strong one as well about the business case as well. It is a very good one. I think that well, I don't think I'm unique in this, but I think people tend to stay with their bank because it's a bit of a hassle to change, isn't it?
Because it's easy.
So a particular bank, and sort of join a bank when you're a student and stop with it for the rest of your life. But I think if there are a compelling business case that I don't know, for example, that one particular banking group really pushed that they were providing ATMs that had really good color contrast on them, and you could enlarge the text and you could do things like that, just like with an iPad, and they had an audio output option as well. That might be quite a compelling point. And I think just to finish on around the color contrast issue, it links again with one of Josh's excellent points that very few innovations only benefits one particular group. Very few things, let's say, only benefit visually impaired people. So many more people would benefit from machines you don't kind of have to peer at and the sun's shining on them because the contrast isn't very good. If the text was large and the contrast was good, that's going to benefit significantly more people than just visually impaired people. So very few things just benefit one particular group. And obviously things can go the other way, so make a change in one particular area, and it can have impact in another area as well. So you can kind of flip those things around. But on the positive, very few things only pertain and have benefit to one particular group. And I think that's probably an illustration of that point.
Okay, brilliant, guys. Loads of stuff there. I'm going to come on and talk about I suppose what's being done at the moment and what's going on. But before we do that, we might just quickly remind people that you can post messages in chat if you'd like to put any messages or comments to our panelists, and you can also raise your hand if you would like to actually speak and ask a question. And Sharon, I don't know if you have anything you would like to feed back to us at the moment.
Yes, I have a couple of really good points from Matthew Clark.
Oh yeah.
Just talking about the ATM issues, that it was kind of good there for a while where you could plug in your headphones and you could listen, and now they're all turning to touchscreen. He also said he used one for the first time in Brighton, and I think it was nationwide, and his fully sighted friend found it hard to use, let alone himself. So he's a bit concerned that he's going to be excluded from cash withdrawals altogether. He also mentioned a bank called Monzo, which I think is one of these ones that's a bit like Revolut maybe. And he was involved with them from the start and spoke to the founders at an event in Edinburgh, and asked them to consider accessibility, and they were all yes, of course. And he emailed them, and years later, he didn't get anything back. But anyway, he found out that their ID scanning process when you register is inaccessible. So you're kind of, it's a bit of a non-starter from the beginning with that. So it's a bit disappointing. And also Liz McLucky, if I'm saying that right, says that she doesn't use a PIN with her cards. She does signature only. And that's
interesting.
Very good. Okay.
That's a possible option.
I didn't know you could still do that.
I didn't know you could do that.
And I don't think you can do it everywhere. I saw that comment, Sharon.
Okay.
Actually, I thought it was interesting because I was in a supermarket yesterday, and just for some reason I happened to notice the sign that says the machine is for chip and pin only, that they won't accept signature. So that's further limiting people's options.
Yeah.
And Paul Clayton just said there he uses Apple Pay. I use Google Pay a lot. I don't know how comfortable people are with using those kind of payment methods where there isn't a limit, is there?
My understanding is that they use, and maybe Josh, this might be something that you're a bit more, you would be more knowledgeable, but they use a unique identifier once only, so your actual card never gets sent through.
That's right.
Either.
Exactly. It's a really good point. And Sharon, thanks for bringing this whole area up. Yeah, they use a proxy. So what happens is a temporary credit card number is generated for every single transaction. So you don't actually broadcast your real card number at all.
That does make it fun when going back to get a refund, though, because they say, "What's your card number?" and they start reading off the last digits. I'm like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, they must have some way of
Yeah, no,
tracking
is
that stuff,
definitely,
right? So
yeah, definitely within
yeah.
Apple, you can do it through the wallet. I think you can go to the
Right.
merchant, but Google, I
Yeah,
don't know what Google has.
there's basically a bunch of stuff that happens behind the scenes in the middle, really fast, which you're just not aware of, that manage the transactions in more of a secure way. But just on this, there was a broader point made earlier about these things, and just my own self, for us sharing our own stories about what happened, like when we were down the shop. I've had problems lately with mine just not being accepted at terminals. I have this thing. And I'd be curious to hear what you guys think of where I'm being told to insert my card when I don't have a physical card. I've just got the actual Mo phone.
The thing on
So
your phone,
yeah, and I'm getting like, insert card, and no, and then they're looking at you across the counter, and you're going, well, I'm not broke really. And then you have that kind of embarrassment and all the rest of it. And then after a while you're going, oh God, maybe I am, because it was really not working. I had a kids party a while ago and a whole load of stuff there, the ice cream melting in the bag. I had to go to 3 separate terminals before the thing actually worked. So I'm really curious about this notion of, I suppose, like, you were very polite, Stuart, earlier when you were talking about it, when Richard was commenting as well about being disempowered by these experiences. But I suggest to some degree they're actually made very vulnerable, potentially quite socially vulnerable, people with disabilities who may have these type of experiences, because you really are waving a flag in a way for, like, I mean, because we talk about these in the technological space, right? We talk about what you call touch surface. So that would be ID points which make up an identificational or an identifiable profile about a person, right? So everything that you do is a data touch point, like a surface, which creates a matrix or a profile about an individual, which can then be used to sell you advertising, courtesy of our friends at Facebook or whatever it is, and all of these platforming type things. But there's much more to it now than that's happening IRL, as the kids say these days, in real life. I mean, I think there's much more potential for it to go quite badly wrong, and I do think it's something that should really be looked at, because it's one thing to be a little bit disempowered or inconvenienced. It's another thing to actually turn your day-to-day interactions into a security risk, right? So yeah, I think that's a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose there's always that feeling of, as you said, Josh, you're feeling maybe vulnerable, but then you're wondering, okay, if you give that pin or you speak that pin to someone, maybe 10 days later, there's a transaction that pops up somewhere, I didn't see this.
If you're at the point, Stuart, where you have to do that, the system's already broken.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right. It's already broken. It's gone past like being, not very good. It's already broken. Yeah.
I see a couple of raised hands here as well. So I think there's some people who want to come in on this discussion as well. We'd love to hear your questions. We will ask people to keep their questions as quickly as you can, because we only have an hour. So we want to try and keep within the time that we have. So I'm going to just bring Phil Daniel in, and then after that we'll have Tina. So Phil, you should be able to unmute yourself, hopefully. I'll try unmuting you again. I think we have you, Phil. Or maybe we don't have Phil. Okay, we'll come back to Phil in a sec if we can, and we'll go to Tina. Tina, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's actually Ian. But I was going to say, you should never give your PIN number out to anybody, because you don't know who's around. You don't know who's going to pinch your card if it happens. I'd always go to the bank and ask them for a chip and sign card, which my wife has. It means you can't use the cash point machines, but you can get cash back on most supermarkets doing that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So asking for what did you call it, Ian? Sorry.
Fine.
Ship and sign. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So can I just come in on that, Stuart? I think
Yeah.
that the issue that's really helpful. Thank you for that. And also the second point as well, it's particularly helpful around the ability to be able to go into a supermarket and get cash back is something that we'd like to see much more widely known and understood, because that is a very helpful workaround if there isn't an ATM in the immediate vicinity and the shop's nearer, or the ATM isn't usable because it doesn't have an audio or output, so perhaps a person without any sort of tool can't use that. So we'd be very keen to see an increased awareness amongst service providers, but also consumers about being able to get £50 cash back. So that's massively helpful and mitigates some of the issues that have been discussed so far.
Yeah,
so that's a really helpful point.
Yeah, and I suppose it also speaks to your point, Richard, which you made earlier, that if you're trying to mitigate, you want to have some cash so that you don't have this issue when you're going to pay at a chip and pin terminal. Perhaps you can't even get the cash in the first place from the bank because the ATM is not accessible. So if there's some way around that.
True, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try bring Phil in once more. So Phil, you should be able to unmute yourself. And if not, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, good discussion. I just wanted to say I've raised a number of issues with my bank, which is Virgin Money, and always logged them as complaints, which is what you have to do. And I have been awarded quite a bit of compensation, but that's not really what I want. And on the last two, I've actually referred them. The answer has been, yes, we know we've got problems, but we have no timetable to fix them, which to me could mean we'll never fix them. And I've referred them to the Financial Ombudsman, who have investigated, but their conclusion is that the bank have done enough. Which my view is they haven't done enough, because there's lots of things on their apps which I can't do.
Bill, you've brought us on to a really nice segue, by the way. So thanks for that point, because I'm going to go back to the guys about that in a sec. So thanks a million for starting that discussion. Richard, what's kind of who's advocating? Again, I'm not asking you to put on either hat or whichever hat you wish to wear in this answer, but who's advocating for change, I suppose, for people with disabilities, and what's going on in the space at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think, as Josh said earlier on, that there is a good deal more understanding within the sector itself about some of the issues that we've been discussed, and the Financial Conduct Authority, which is a UK body, and UK Finance as well, are very, I think, very much more aware of some of the concerns. So I think that they are, with us with sort of RNIB and with BATA about some of the things we're saying. But such a I suppose one of the challenges in this area is that there's an awful lot, and it's about trying to work out who the correct target is for the particular message. So for example, if accessibility of ATMs and use of bank cards, and particularly as we move now towards sort of increasing use of flat cards about the numbers on them, is very much sort of an issue around banking and how they can make those more accessible and distinctive. The payment systems is a more tricky one, because banks would acquire those from a number of providers, so that the message would again go to a different group. But I think, to go back to your initial question, that there is definitely an increased awareness and increased understanding, and I think a willingness to address some of these points as well from within the sector. But I think what would be hugely helpful is if banks collectively or individually just perhaps undertook an audit of where they currently are, because without doing that, it's probably hard for them, and certainly hard for us, to be able to get a clear picture of how the current situation is in terms of accessibility and what is working well and what needs to be improved. So if banks, for example, took an audit of how many of their ATMs have audio output, for example, and of those, how many of them actually switched on and how often they're checked, that would be hugely helpful, because in 12 months' time, we could then go back to them and check, you know, how that's improved and what the situation is. So it's just about, I think, being clear in our messaging, which I think we are, in terms of the 3 or 4 points we'd like to address to banking, and then getting an understanding and engagement of how that might progress, and I think probably getting a bit of the business case benefit to do that, as well as mentioned earlier on. So if one particular bank is able to say 90% of our ATMs that have audio output, I think that's probably quite a compelling quite a business case. So yeah, we are getting more inroads, getting more understanding within the sector, but crucially to come back to my earlier points, must be involved from the outset. I think that's a key point to succeeding in any area. But yeah, that's I guess a work in progress to some extent, isn't it?
You could almost have a report card system, couldn't you? You know, what banks have done really well this year, and, you know, publish this stuff and say, these are the banks who are doing this stuff really well. And maybe that's going back to the point that was made earlier on about people maybe who sort of say, oh, I've been with my bank for life, it's too difficult to change. Well, if you thought one bank was particularly accessible, you might say, do you know something, it might be worth all the hassle to go and change.
Encourage les autres. Yeah, absolutely.
Josh, I think we asked you this very question last year, but I always enjoy talking to you about this because it's really important, and it's about how, and by the way, for people who weren't at the session last year, Josh also joined us last year for Global Accessibility Awareness Day, so it's great to have Josh back. But one thing we talked to you about, I know, was just how people can advocate for themselves, and it kind of goes back to the point that Phil made, where he has gone to his bank and he's made complaints, and he's made complaints to the financial ombudsman, I think he said. Yeah. How can people, because sometimes people get overwhelmed with, it's inaccessible, I can't use it, and you almost feel you're the problem.
Right.
But,
yeah.
But you're not, right?
Yeah. No, you're not, and you have to let them know. I mean, it's really critically important that you let people know when you've got a problem with the service, and if it's an accessibility related problem, you have it, then others have got it also. And if you don't, well, then I suppose you could say you're tacitly accepting it in a way by not saying anything about it, and that's not something that we want to do or we want to maintain. I really like what was said earlier. Richard made a point about, you know, that there are none of the benefits of accessibility that happen in isolation or only impact on one group. There's a halo effect around that, and that's also really important. So in a way, I guess you could, you could even say, this is an issue that affects me, but if you're aware that it could affect another person, state that, make that point. And then even if we could, when we're given out, if we could say, well, fixing this would benefit X, Y, and Z, and try and in a way as advocates sell the benefit to the person who you're complaining about their service, because you know, in a way it becomes accessibility becomes another thing for people to do in an organization. I mean, for example, if we play devil's advocate and you look at conformance and compliance from the perspective of the stuff an organization has to do, there's gazillions of things now, whether it's GDPR, whether it's environmental concerns, whether it's, you know, like accessibility, whether it's right. So just the list goes on and on these days of kind of conformance requirements for not just government or public sector, but, you know, for business. And so I suppose to be a positive advocate means not just to state there's a problem, but if you're aware that the solution will benefit you and others, to state that too, and to be clear about the kind of wins and the gains of making stuff more accessible and removing barriers. I think that could be a powerful thing.
You make a really interesting point, Josh, about maybe complacency on the part of users with disabilities. And I'm just thinking of my own bank's app has a couple of buttons. I think one says button 0, and button 0 is to go back to the home screen to view your accounts. I didn't know that. I just pressed it, or maybe I asked someone at the time, but I've never, and I, you know, to my shame, I sit here, I've never contacted them and said, could you please fix that button 0? Maybe someone else has, but maybe we all need to, as people with disabilities, as users of this stuff, I guess you know, we all have a responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And this and on a I mean, something that comes to mind when you use the word responsibility, like where everyone is talking about rights and entitlements, right? You know, in different sectors of our society. But what about responsibility? What about the things we need to be doing as people who are members of a society in different contexts? This goes beyond the disability area, but in a broader level, in a broader kind of personal integrity level, we all have to be living in a way which, you know, coordinates with our values and is in sync with the way we choose to live and what we feel is important. And if certain things in society aren't the way they need to be, we need to fight for those things in a way which is doesn't have to be a fight, but you know, where you say, well, actually, no, this could be better, and therefore, you know, we want to see things iterate in a positive way. So yeah,
and I suppose also letting whoever the service provider is, in this case, we're talking about the, you know, letting our banks, for example, know when they're doing something right. You know,
yeah, well, exactly. That's it. I mean, I heard the other day, I heard a thing. What was it? I really liked it. It said, be lucky, and then the other thing was well and also recognize when you are lucky. You know, and I think maybe we have to also appreciate when things are good, and accessibility is one of those things, right, where it kind of comes in waves. There's a kind of a wave of interest in accessibility and in inclusion, which is really which is great, and we kind of ride the crest of that wave, and then maybe interest falls away or things like that. So we have to make sure when things are good to support that too and be positive about that as well. Yeah,
that's a crucial point, isn't it? I think it's we as RNIB, we as BATA and banks and the financial sector as a whole, we're only ever as good as the information we get, aren't we? So the more information that we receive, the more information that we can share the financial sector, but more information they can get from individuals, it's obviously massively helpful. But crucially, we're able to provide a lot of the answers. It's not just asking a lot of questions. We can actually point to good practice on what that looks like and the benefits and the empowerment that comes from that. So we can point to a lot of positivity within particular areas. So it's not just asking a lot of questions. We can provide a lot of the answers, and quite importantly, dealing with business, quite a lot of the solutions we're looking at are actually cost neutral, aren't they? It's not really much of a cost to what we're talking about, which is might be appealing to these days.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can see or hear lots of clicking in the chat window. So I just want to make sure we capture any comments that might be coming in that our panel might want to feed back on. And I don't know, Sharon or Fionnuala, do either of you feel like trying to summarize? I suspect there's a lot of it, any of the discussion that might be going on.
Yes, well, start with
it's a big job, Sharon.
Let's start with the very scary point that sometimes we see a lot of the older generation just go up to the cashier, open their purse and say, please take what you want, because they just don't know how else to manage it, which is very scary. But yeah, a lot of people are using Apple Pay, a lot of people are using cash back. Tesco's, Don's, Hickey's. Although you can't do cash back with credit cards, is that right? Or you have to pay a charge or something. I think we were discussing
I think so,
that. Yeah. What else? There was something else. Sorry, bear with me. Oh, putting your card number in Braille and having it handy. Although you don't really want to be carrying around Braille sheets of Braille, but you know, maybe you could, you know, the sticky Braille, the Braille onto clear plastic stuff. I can't remember what it's called. You could put that on your card maybe, if you're a Braille reader. And Paul Clayton said that he also contacted the Financial Ombudsman about the issues with ATMs, but they said they were powerless to do anything about it. I wonder if that might change.
That's
soon.
Terrible. I mean, like,
Isn't
really,
it?
isn't it? I mean, sorry,
awful.
I know, Sharon, you think that's just awful. Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't it also awful? Was it Phil or was it someone else who mentioned earlier that they had contacted their bank, or maybe it was Ian, and said that, you know, accessibility, yes, we know it's not right, but we can't really tell you when it will be fixed. You know, was that kind of, so they were saying they openly knew there was a problem, but they had no real plan to make it better.
Yeah,
Can I speak to that a little bit? Richard, you
Yeah.
go, and then I have a comment on
sorry,
that.
yes.
You go for it.
I was going to say that is obviously frustrating in itself, but more frustrating in the specific that the issue is probably one that could be at least mitigated, if not removed, if perhaps visually impaired people had been involved with them from the commencement of whatever the issue might be, or had been involved in discussions about how it could work. So it's frustrating because that probably hasn't happened, but and frustrating because the solutions probably to these are out there and are being used by other providers. So it's a whole, things are all linked together in terms of the level of frustration. But I mean, I would be surprised if that wasn't, the double problem, that one, we hadn't been involved from the outset, and two, the problems could be fixed and are being fixed in other areas. So I suppose perhaps there's an issue about maybe voting with your feet and going, as I say, looking at other options and other banks, which is kind of a business case that they could all maybe think about.
Josh, you were going to come in on that?
Yeah, just something that comes to mind when we're talking about this is that, for example, if we just pare back where we're at right now in Ireland in terms of conformance and requirement from the public sector. So that we're looking at the Web Accessibility Directive in Ireland. So the public sector, government and whatnot need to have their websites and services in shape to a particular standard by a particular well, Ireland was late to the table implementing the directive, but essentially, it's got people's attention, right? It's got people in the room. A part of those conformance requirements is that people have to be able to produce an accessibility statement on their websites, right? Now, this is something that we help our clients. We do the auditing, we do the usability testing with people with disabilities, we do the whole full stack thing. But a part of what's required is you have an accessibility statement that tells you, really, it's an inaccessibility statement. It says what's wrong with the site, but more importantly as well, it tells you what you're going to do to fix it. And it actually, you have to be able to outline a roadmap or just broad strokes of what you're going to do. First of all, this serves two purposes. One, tells people that there are issues. Two, that they're aware of them. And three, that they're going to fix them. And here's what we're going to do. A part of the Accessibility Act, I would say, will follow a similar route in the commercial sector, in that, the commercial sector will have to state, hey, this is a problem, we know what it is, and this is what we're going to do. Now, I'm not totally 100% sure if that is exactly the case right now under the strictures of the Act, but certainly under the directive, which relates to public sector. And the idea is that the Act is going to broaden out the reach of the accessibility requirements beyond government into the commercial sector more broadly, and as well generate markets and free up the purple pound. Or when we were in the EU, Richard, we had a purple pound, right? So
yeah, those for the days.
Those are the days. So yeah, I'm just curious about that. And Richard, I mean, question maybe to you, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose the whole situation really is just about trying to increase awareness, understanding, isn't it? Of how, because sometimes improvements can be made, and then something can happen to reduce that improvement. So someone mentioned opening a purse and just handing out a wad of cash. Well, one of the frustrations is that certainly the Bank of England, and I think the Bank of Scotland follow suit by making notes which are actually very distinctive, and different sizes and very good color contrast, and also have different number dots on them to indicate which note is which. So we had that improvement, an access improvement about using cash, and then not long after you have a situation where a change in policy in the same area means that something actually becomes less usable, less accessible, because so I think trying to have a more holistic approach to this rather than making a change in one particular area and thinking it won't have impacts in other areas is manifestly problematic. And so having a clear understanding of what is available and the benefits of what's available, and then thinking about other areas, how that can be enhanced rather than how a change can reduce that, would make a significant difference in terms of how the sector would work, but crucially how we as visually impaired people would be able to work and function within that sector.
I think there's, and would I be maybe it again might be interesting to hear feedback from the audience, but there's a generational thing now as well. Is there people, maybe younger people, certainly a lot younger than me, people are maybe moving around banks a bit more. Some people are sticking with these online banks pretty much for everything, you know. So I've heard of people who are getting paid into their Revolut because they have an IBAN and they have, you know, they're now a proper bank trading as a bank. And maybe those people in the future will just sort of move. There won't be that loyalty that might have been there for years, and maybe that will push the accessibility ticket a little bit more, or you would hope.
Yeah, I think that's some interesting points to just. It'd be very interesting to find out about the accessibility of banks that exist mostly. I think Monzo do have a few branches, but mostly online, and what that looks like, and who they worked with in terms of making that fully usable. I think that would be interesting, because, as I say, going back to some things that Josh has said, a lot of this good practice is out there. It's being used now. It's under, but it's not sort of consistent, and in terms of consistently understood by consumers, which would presumably help the ability to move around, but probably not consistently understood by the sector itself either. Which again comes back to the without one sound like a broken 45. It's hence why we need to be involved, you know, with these things from the commencement of any change, to exactly avoid some of these frustrations once a change actually comes into effect.
Okay, we are coming towards the last 5 minutes of the session. I'm going to bring in one more raised hand and then pop over to Sharon for a quick look at the chat, because I know there's been a few more messages. So I know one or two more people had hands raised, but I'm going to go to Ian Lackey. So Ian, you should be able to unmute yourself, I hope. And we'd be delighted to hear from you.
Yes, it's all very well to say, oh, you should advocate, but sometimes it's just so damn hard to advocate. You know, if you have an issue, like I once had an issue with my bank app where it wouldn't let me make a payment when a cash transfer when VoiceOver was on. And it was very difficult to speak to anybody who could do anything about it. And they just wouldn't believe that it was an accessibility issue. They said, oh, it's a timing issue. And it happened because the people who developed the thing hadn't tested it with VoiceOver. Mm-hmm. You know, obviously accessibility was well down on their radar. And what can you do about that? Fortunately, they fixed it pretty quickly. Otherwise, I would have been stuck. But, you know, I've had this happen other times. There was once when on the display of transactions, they were showing, but VoiceOver couldn't read them. It just shows that accessibility in the development community, if you want, is too far down the radar.
I think Josh might have a few words on that one. So Ian, thanks for the question and the point, and I think it's very well made. Josh, is there anything you can?
Well, I mean, I hear a certain fatigue in there, and I totally get that. And you know, in a way, I suppose you could say, how often can you beat the same drum about things? And I've been working in this area for 20 plus years now, and I think the same issues kind of come around again and again. So I totally hear that as well. I was happy to hear that you got your bug fixed, though, relatively sharpish. Mm-hmm. That's good. That's like the revolution is incremental. I mean, that doesn't make a great t-shirt, but you know, there you go. That's probably more true to say, you know. Well, yeah, I hear that kind of fatigue, but I think, Stewie, you hit the nail on the head about that complacency bit. If you're using it and you're hearing unlabeled button 0, unlabeled button 3, you know what they do because you've rocked through it so many times. Just let them know. Send them an email. Yeah. That's it. You know, and yeah, just keep rocking on.
And I have decided, and Josh, thanks for, because I'm going to ring or get on Twitter or whatever my bank today and just ask them would they fix the button 0.
Yeah.
So, there you go.
Why
Hopefully that
doesn't
makes
everybody
sense.
do that now? I mean, like, just on a personal note, I mean, I think banking is hilarious. I mean, like, I give them all my money and they give me a little plastic
know.
card. I mean, you know, I think we could do a little bit better.
Okay. Sharon, I know it's probably difficult, but is there anything you probably had the hardest job? Is there anything you want to pull out from the chat from
Just
the
a
last
few,
minutes?
yeah, just a few practical things from Maria. Just about cash reader apps that are available for telling you what note you have in your hand.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work on Scottish and Northern Irish sterling notes, but generally works well on other things. And there's also called Be My Eyes, and they could tell you what you have. But still, we, the independence thing is is the thing there. Yeah, but that's before the cash reader app. That's what Maria used all the time. Yeah, and also, hang on, who was that? Matthew Clark said it's very rare that he sees an accessibility statement that speaks about more than just the website and its content. So it doesn't actually talk about the wider products and services that are or are not accessible.
Yeah, just on that though, Sharon, and that's a really good point. I think that's going to change under the Act. I now, don't quote me on this. I know this has been recorded, but my gut is that it will have to, because how else are we going to define where services have been worked on and where they need work if they're not actually written about somewhere, right? So I think, whether that's in an accessibility statement or somewhere else, I think watch that space. I do think that's something that's going to happen. But that's a really good point, Matthew. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, really great points being made. Josh and Richard, thank you so much for not just your expertise and your time today, but for giving us, I suppose, so much food for thought and for really helping us delve into the area of financial accessibility, I suppose. And it's as it is with all other things, it's a journey, isn't it? And we'll always be looking for something or finding something that needs to be improved. But I think if we can all collectively do a little bit of feedback to our financial institutions, as Josh, as you said, you've given them all your money, so we'd like to get some value for that money. Richard, thank you sincerely to you and
pleasure. Thank you.
And the British Assistive Technology Association. We've loved partnering with you guys today to run this session. Thanks to everybody who's joined us for this Global Accessibility Awareness Day session. We love doing this every year at Sight and Sound Technology because we're hugely committed to digital inclusion. And many thanks to Sharon Lyons and to Fionnuala Murphy, who had to leave us a little bit early, for their help and support today. Take care from everyone at Sight and Sound and BATA. This is Stuart Lawler signing off. Thanks, Josh and Richard. And
Pleasure.
talk to you all soon.
Thank you very much. Cheers, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Emil. Thanks for having me.